Are you ready? Yeah, we are streaming. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our September Shadow Authority Executive meeting. We need to finish in time because tonight everybody's going to have a big choice. Is it going to be Boris or Bake Off? And that's going to be the question that everyone will be talking about in the morning. So let's make sure that we don't do anything to upset any domestic issues that people might have when they're trying to choose between Boris or Bake Off later on. So apologies for non-attendance. We have none?
Not received any apologies for non-attendance, Chair.
Thank you. Notification to address the meeting?
None from members of the public. Councillor Jonathan Harris would like to speak on the item 11B, which is the motion referred from the Shadow.
Any declarations of interest from members? And the minutes of the last meeting were held on the 25th, circulated the pages 5 to 10 in the pack. So is there anything on page 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10? So is it your wish that we approve these as a true and correct record? Agreed? Thank you. I have no further announcements to make, so we move on to item 6, Programme Director's update. Paul.
Thank you, Chair, and just ask Paul to share the slides on screen so people know which ones I'm referring to. So just in terms of the programme notes, just to say on comms and engagement, all the additional resources are now in place, and we've got a fully functioning comms team on the programme now. And also to say that George Candler is picking up the senior responsible owner role and overseeing the whole of the comms and engagement work, which we're really grateful for. In terms of the trade unions, we met with the trade unions on the 13th of August, and what you'll see tonight is the detailed blueprints, which are an extension of the high-level blueprints. And we shared the high-level blueprints with the trade unions on the 13th of August and explained how to read them. And really that was about how services come together or disaggregate on day one. And that is essentially the same in the detailed blueprint. So that was shared with the trade unions on the 13th of August. Blueprint preparation has been going on through there, and we've also held workshops with the executive, and also just last week an ICT workshop to go into the kind of benefits realisation side of ICT, so less of the nuts and bolts and more about the capabilities that we're enabling for the new organisations. And in terms of blueprints, of course, a really important part of that is the budgets and how those will iterate over the coming months. And budget workshops are organised or being organised for members as we move through that process. And of course, we've got the Task and Finish group on medium-term financial planning leading on that work. We've been doing much of the work around implementation reporting and preparation for the implementation phase. So there'll be a dedicated report for West Northamptonshire on progress against that plan. And that'll be first introduced in October, but all the work behind the scenes has been done to put that in place. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later on. As you'll recall, there was a programme health check undertaken independently through the LGA. That health check produced 30 recommendations, and these have been now turned into an action plan, and all those actions are owned by senior officers to make sure that we respond to that action plan. And the action plan was about making sure that we've got the best possible programme in place for that implementation phase. Also to say what your notes will say is that the recruitment process was underway for transformation directors. I'm pleased to say that's completed and those appointments have been made, and they'll be working with the programme as soon as possible to ensure day one, but also, most importantly, to start picking up that transformational activity in the journey beyond vesting day. So that's really positive. Just moving on to the next slide, high-level programme status. There's 3 ambers to draw to your attention. But also, finance was amber in the last reporting period. It's now moved to green. And I'd just like to extend my thanks to members and officers in those finance task and finish groups that made really good progress in those activities to get the programme in the place it's in now. Corporate is amber at the moment, and that's really about establishing the resource base required for the implementation phase and making sure we've got all that capacity in the right place at the right time. We expect that to move to green in the next reporting period, making good progress there. Children's is still amber and will likely remain amber, and that's for the reasons of the very tight critical path for the 1st of November go live. It is on track, there is no room for slippage, but we are monitoring that really closely and meet weekly on progress there. The other aspect of that is the delivery of the savings, which Audra will talk more about, but the delay that's been presented by activities that couldn't happen because of COVID. So those 2 things there are impacting on the programme, and it's therefore reporting amber. Adults is reporting amber for 2 reasons as well. But
so excuse me, Paul, is it just my screen, or is that amber red slide not actually being updated?
Oh, that's the one. Sorry, I didn't look at the screen, but it was up. That's the slide that I'm talking about now, Chair. So adults is amber, but expected to move to green in the next period, and that's because of the intense work going on to disaggregate the adult service in October, late October, in line with the soft split that's being proposed there for the transformational activities in social care. And there has been some delay in some of the savings due to COVID as well. So I'm only highlighting those things that are in exception and what we're intending to do about them and where we think the direction of travel will be for next month. In terms of day one assurance, that's all about that work to build the critical path and ensure that we can land the new council on the 1st of April and making sure that every piece of activity is picked up across the programmes and in each programme. And there is a clear owner and clear activity identified. And as we start to track that activity through, is all about that day one assurance there and that list of activities there. There's 80 day one requirements or so, but many sub-requirements that sit below that. And we're working with each of the programmes to clarify and resolve what those critical products are and the reporting and implementation issues or concerns that we'll have going through it on a week-by-week basis as we move through. Just moving on to the next slide, that's an example of what we've pulled out of that activity for this reporting period. So what you'll see there is the blue line are critical products where they should have started and haven't started, and there's none in that category at the moment. So we've got a number of products that don't need to start yet. The next category is red, where we have progress concerns, and there are none in that activity. And then there are a small number in the amber category, and what we mean there is it's amber, but it's under increased watch. So we're not concerned about it, but we're paying particular attention to those. One of the ones to exemplify there is OutSystems. And OutSystems is the platform that we've built some apps on historically, and those apps provide services such as Green Badge. And OutSystems is not a system that's going to be usable in the period after vesting day, so we need to put something else in place to do that. That's all in train. We're not worried about that or concerned about it. We understand what we have to do, and there is a plan in place, but we're keeping a close watch on it. And that's an example there of those things. So that's about now stabilising that, regularising the process for capturing and reporting, and making sure that this executive and the authority as a whole is clearly cited on all the activities required for day one. and supporting programme managers to ensure they're really focused on doing the doing and not just spending a lot of time on the bureaucracy of reporting, and making sure there's a clear separation and accountability in that, but also with the rigour and robustness that's required to provide that assurance and understand where we are at any one time. And how we do the kind of dip testing by exception to validate how things are being reported across the piece. I'd also just mention there as well, again, that George Candler has agreed as Senior Responsible Officer to take responsibility of day one assurance as well, which is also really welcome and brings another level of challenge, which is welcome, and we'll be working with the programme very closely and the day one programme manager as we work through this. And what you will see at the next executive in October is a dedicated report for the implementation for West Northamptonshire, picking up all those things that have to be done for both, but also the things specific in one plan and one report with the detail required to provide the level of assurance. So, Paul, thank you. Moving on, just very quickly, change management. There's a lot of activity there on the first slide about what's being done and the preparations being put in place. A number of people involved in pilots, voice automation pilots and that kind of thing, and how we get things in place ready to support the change. Next slide is where we're at with Change Champions recruitment. So we've had an increase from the last period to 332 now. We have some attrition, but all of that is carefully watched, so we know exactly why people have left the programme in these roles. And I don't think there's anything to be concerned about. The attrition, the 14 that resigned, mainly to do with either leaving the employment of the councils or moving roles, and therefore they can't operate in that change role. So that's all tracked to make sure that there's nothing that we do that means we can't support change champions in a more effective way, and ensure that we can recruit more. And the two graphs you see on that page are the numbers per council and the resignations by council on the right-hand side. The next one is the gap analysis that we're working through and talking to chief execs and leadership teams across the councils. We've identified where we have change champions and where we need more, and validating where we think we need more but aren't quite clear that there's an obvious requirement. It might be that there's a service and there's only one person in that service and we need to pick that up in a different way. So we're just validating that, but that gives us a clear picture of what we need and how our efforts will be concentrated on making sure we have those people in the right places over the next few weeks. And then the future actions around September. So we've got a lot of engagement going on, which we'll cover in the next slide. The change champions are really important to that. I did a Q&A session and we had about 80 change champions on that last week. And I think they found that really helpful because I was able to explain to them what the blueprints are and, more importantly, what the blueprints aren't, and the journey from here, and making it really clear to colleagues that the blueprints are the start and not the end of the journey. There are some things that we've got to do really quickly under challenging circumstances, and that we wouldn't have envisaged communicating via Zoom and all that kind of thing, but we are where we are with that, and we have to work with the communication tools that's safe to work with. So it's not exactly as we'd want it, but we are working through that and making sure we're engaging wherever possible across all the stakeholders. So there's also the communications and consultation around council tax harmonisation and the reduction scheme and those kind of things that will be heavily involved in the work that needs to be done through the change managers, change champions as well. So that just brings us on to the communication and engagement bit. So throughout September, I'm sure members will know that we've been doing a number of sessions. So we did a whole session which was recorded for the workforce based on a blueprint briefing. That's been saved, recorded, so that those that couldn't get there can still watch that. And we did the same for the West members as well. That's recorded and there. I recognise it wasn't a two-way engagement, and there'll be lots of opportunities to do the two-way engagement, but it's more an explanation of how to view and read the blueprints, and then that engagement will help and be enriched by understanding how and why we are where we are with those, and I know Anna will touch on that as well later on. So there's a number of things that have been going on through that period. Again, we met with the trade unions again, and shared the detailed blueprints that you're looking at tonight with them, and explained the way that this is a continuation of the high-level blueprints, and trying to be really clear with the trade unions that the bulk of that is about how services come together and disaggregate, and we have very little choices around those. We have got feedback, and we will share some of that feedback with the executive later, and how we're going to deal with that with the trade unions as well. The survey on logos is closed now, and really good responses around that. And we've got a number of next steps there on the following slide, Paul, sorry. In terms of an overview of comms and engagement, there is a lot of activity going on. I can only see that building and being even greater over the coming weeks and months as we start to engage with, particularly with the workforce, the formal consultation through trade unions and so on, as we shape the new West Northamptonshire Council for the 1st of April and beyond. I think, Chair, and that's the main highlights that I just wanted to cover. And I know Audra's going to cover the finance update as well, Chair. Happy to take questions at whichever point you feel.
So before we move on to Audra, Lizzie.
Quick question. NBC, the number per council of change champions seems quite low, because I thought NBC workforce size and budget was higher than DGC and SNC. It just seems quite low. Or is that my limited understanding of the situation?
No, as a ratio, it probably is low, but what we need to do is get underneath the detail of that, and that's what we're doing. So we've been working with George, and whoever's George is nominated to work with us to identify where we need additional change champions from George's organisation there, and in which service areas as well. But as a ratio, it does look low, you are right, in relation to the number of employees.
And is that because there's a reticence to engage as change champions? What's the reasoning behind that? I'm not sure it's reticence, Councillor. I think it's just you know, we had to stop recruiting. We did hold a Change Champions event before the lockdown at the Borough Council. It was for all Change Champions, but it was really well attended and really positive. So I don't know if there's one specific reason why that's the case at Northamptonshire, at Northampton County Council, but we are working through the detail of those and where we need to engage with more people. And if you look at the next slide on there, and in terms of MBC, you'll see that the very dark coloured, I've only got a black and white copy in front of me, but there's a bigger gap to fill there than some of the other areas.
Just to briefly add through you, Chair, that we've started work on that quite vigorously in the last few weeks. So we've identified where there are gaps in certain teams, and we're starting to fill those already. So just to give some confidence back to members that you'll see those numbers go up for the next update next month.
But in absolute terms, there's sort of 24-ish across most of the councils. Kettering got a few more, and Northampton's got a few more. Northampton County Council obviously got more. I think the one that is probably one that we just need to think about was the red, amber, green one, which showed the number of services that did or did not have a change champion within them. And all of those have got, you know, a red area. So NCC seemed to have done better at getting change champions everywhere. You know, arguably, you know, looking at the numbers, a bit difficult to read black text on red background, but you know, SNC have got roughly half their services with a change champion. So we probably need to be working on, you know, there's little point in having everybody up for change in only one department. we probably need to do more to get all departments to be up for change. You know, instead of just having a little enthusiastic clique somewhere, but they're all happen to be from one service area.
Yeah, exactly, Chair, and that was the reason why we were very keen to undertake the gap analysis and provide that level of information to us to make sure we targeted the recruitment. And of course, the change champions will be very important on day one and the 30 to 60 days after day one, and how we stabilise things and so on. And they'll play a critical role in that as well. So we need to make sure for that reason alone that we've got the right people in the right service areas, in the right buildings as well, to support that stabilisation phase. When something we were talking about earlier today, and the capability that we need there, and the engine rooms will play a big part in that stabilisation phase as well. So we'll have the experts in the engine rooms that are picking up these problems at a service level and dealing with them really quickly, so we don't distract people from working with residents on delivering those services. So we're formulating a plan for that day one stabilisation, but making sure we've got the change capacity and champions in place really soon now, also obviously to help with the implementation phase.
Okay, any other questions from Cabinet colleagues? Phil?
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. Talking about communications and engagement, and talking about the new systems coming in and telephony in particular, what sort of performance indicators are we looking at for telephony, for example? How are we setting a time limit on the time from a person phoning in and getting their call answered to actually speaking to a human being? Or are they, you know, how are we going to make sure that we've not got all this voice activation passed from pillar to post, and it's about 10-15 minutes till you get to speak to somebody, a human being? I mean, are we setting some basic standards in devising what we're devising to ensure that the public aren't messed about and easily get through to somebody?
Absolutely, and maybe Richard might want to comment on this, being responsible for that area of the programme, and I know Katie's online as well, but it'd be really important that we get those metrics in place to fully understand, and not just about setting targets, but also setting the measurements to understand what that looks like and what we need to do about it. And the whole idea of the automated side is that we create the capacity to deal with the more complex issues that take more time, and making sure that we automate and deal with things that are fairly straightforward and free up people to deal with all that complexity that they currently deal with, as well as the low level activity. And what we need to do is create the metric to ensure that we're measuring that that's actually being successful in doing what it needs to do, and freeing capacity to deal with that complexity where we need to. But absolutely, the metrics need to be agreed. They will be developed. We'll have some harmonisation to do across the metrics of each of the councils that make up the West, and agree what those appropriate metrics and measures are to be able to report to you the impact and the effect of that. You know, no diminution of services to residents over what they currently get, and the intention is obviously to improve it wherever we possibly can, and there's some work being done around opening times and service times as well, and consulting the public on what they'd like to see there, and looking at that and developing that in terms of that capability for residents to contact us 24/7 wherever possible. And a lot of that obviously is through self-help and automation.
Thank you, Chair. That was helpful.
Richard, you indicated to speak.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think Paul has covered it almost entirely. I was just going to add that the customer services strategy will be coming through through the executive next month. So we're doing a lot of work on that at the moment. We had a very successful member workshop last week to help refine that, and that will start to outline exactly as Paul has indicated, the actual strategy for management of customers. Thank you.
Yeah. I think it'll be actually quite important as well that we manage to put these on performance indicators that we see and that we can manage and that we can shine a spotlight on. So number of calls abandoned is to be quite an important metric, as well as the speed of time to answer them, along with first call resolution, how many people actually get their issue solved the first time they ring up. So that's what we need to be looking at and concentrating on things that we can actually do something about. But Richard knows it's a pet subject of mine, has been at SNC, so I'm sure he's got a lot of recent learning. Any other questions from cabinet colleagues? I'm aware Danielle wants to come in, but I just want to check anything else from executive colleagues. Danielle.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me ask a question. It was really about the change champions. So I'm really interested in that, because I think that kind of engagement can be really fruitful. I just wondered what the expectation is around the change champions. Are they just receivers of information? Is there a two-way flow? What's the expectation of the outcome of their involvement? I just would like a bit of clarity on that. In terms of customer services, can I just ask if we're going to have one-stop shops as well as web-based services and communications and phone? Are we going to have anywhere where people can physically pop in different localities?
Happy to take those, Chair. And I know Anna will definitely pick up the last question in the presentation on the blueprints, because taking away face-to-face contacts and our services are delivered in communities, and we need to have a presence in those communities, and they need to be accessible for our residents. So that's absolutely the intention, and I know Anna will pick up some of that detail, and it is alluded to in the blueprints, but probably needs a little bit more explanation. So happy to do that. In terms of the expectation on change champions, it's definitely bottom up and not top down. So we want the dialogue to be two-way. So, but what I would stress is that they're not a replacement for the trade unions. They're not there to represent the workforce, and we don't expect their colleagues to be going to change champions to raise issues about things in the programme. There's accepted mechanisms for doing that, but there should be a barometer of how staff are feeling, and that's really important to be able to feed that in. We try, don't always manage it, to involve them as early as possible. So we did share the blueprints slightly ahead of the rest of the workforce with them, and we gave them an explanation of what they are. So if there were any questions, we would understand from the change champions perspective what might be relevant for the wider workforce as well. And as I said earlier, Councillor Stone, the Q&A session that I did with the change champions last week, I found really useful and helpful, and the questions they were raising were really relevant questions, and in some cases we were able to answer them and allay any concerns, and where we couldn't, we committed to ensuring we did answer them, and helping and supporting the change champions to help us with things like FAQs and explaining things in a way that is relevant and not in kind of programme language or too technical jargon, etc. So it's really important that they represent those people that are closest to our residents in this programme, because they're the ones that are dealing with the issues that our residents have and the problems that we have to solve on a day in and day out basis. And that's really important that that's fed into the programme, but also important, in my opinion, in any organisation, that there's a connection from the front line to the chief exec and the leaders. Absolutely. And that's a mechanism to help and support that.
I certainly see the cheerleaders as, the change champions as cheerleaders for change, and in order to be able to say to colleagues in a very friendly way, I've done it, I've made the change, it hasn't done me any harm, give it a go. Which will be much better than anybody on this call saying, don't worry about it, it'll be all right in the night, when people see their colleagues actually knowing that it works. Or
Exactly, Chair.
it's a much better sale. So certainly I think on behalf of everybody at the in the executive, I want to say thanks to all of the change champions everywhere, and quite happy, Paul, when you're having your next get together with them, if I can, to put my head around the door and just say thanks, as much as we can in person, but certainly on whatever Zoom call we'll be doing. I'm more than happy to do that.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure that would be much appreciated. It's probably something that we should actually organise and allow that to be facilitated. I think it would go a long way with the change champions to have that opportunity.
Yeah. So if there's nothing else at this part, we'll move on to order and finance. And I think Audra's going to say everything's cushy.
Good evening, members. Hoping I'm not going to disappoint the chair now. You'll see from the report in front of you that should be familiar now, that we've actually moved to a variance of 468,000, an increase of 229,000 since I last reported to you. What I want to reiterate, the same as last time though, is that this is about a profiling change, and from the detail in there, this is largely down to the build and opening of Oak Tree Rise for transforming care clients being delayed into 21-22. So just to reiterate, as I've said before, the savings impacts that are causing these variants are a profiling issue due to the impacts of COVID and everything else, and not an ability to achieve those savings. So we will see them later on for the benefit of both unitaries. I haven't really got a great deal to add in terms of any changes since, other than that I've just highlighted, other than to say, obviously all eyes are on business as usual, as well as the transformation and the Future Northants programme, with the effects and the recovery of the economy and the further outbreaks of COVID-19 that we're seeing an increase of. So everybody's very mindful of that and conscious of our working arrangements. And just to reassure members that's reviewed constantly to ensure that we stay on track for day one delivery within budget and with our eyes on those savings. And on that note, Chair, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Audra. Any questions? Don't see any. Okay, well, thank you for that. So we'll move on to addressing health inequalities. Item 7, page 31 of the pack. Who's introducing this one?
I think it's me. Sorry, Chair, Anna.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I just noticed that it didn't have a person to present it. So thank you, through you, Chair.
Well, if in doubt, we'll give it all to you then, Anna. That was going to be my next call anyway.
You'll be bored of hearing from me. Okay, thank you. So this is a report that's coming to the West Northamptonshire Shadow Authority as part of the agreed approach that we're taking around any changes within sovereign councils that have a sort of lasting effect into the future and into the territory of the unitaries. And this relates to a report that went to NCC's cabinet last year regarding a public health contract for social wellbeing. That contract actually was due to end some time ago in March 2020, but was extended for a year to allow time to consider how the outcomes that public health was seeking around health inequalities could best be addressed. As members may remember, this is part of spend in public health that was deemed to be non-compliant with the public health grant, largely because actually the kind of delivery that was being done under the social wellbeing contract was actual delivery of either social care packages or indeed actual housing, as opposed to focusing on prevention, which was the main aim of the public health grants. So a report went to NCC's cabinet requesting that a short-term extension of a year to March 2031 was given to the grant at a reduced level to maintain all of those organisations and their contracts during this period, and that Public Health went out for consultation about how best to support some of these prevention activities and these outcomes going forward. So this report basically sets out the plan that Public Health have pursued, and is seeking just endorsement really that will go to tender process later in the year, and also that members note there is an engagement taking place at the moment that ends on the 28th next week, which is going to allow all partners and public to feedback on what should be in that contract. Obviously, there are risks in relation to this, and members may remember that as the public health grant has been used previously to fund particularly day centre places, and also, as I said, some of the housing support, there was a risk that in withdrawing any of this funding, if they weren't supported going forward, that would create further demand into the services. So I can confirm in terms of those risks that adults has been very heavily engaged in this process and what it means, and looking at the customers who are supported from a day centre perspective. And the Chief Housing Officers Group has also been engaged with Public Health in thinking about how they continue to support homelessness and prevention of homelessness going forward. But at this stage, all we're seeking really from the Shadow Executive is that endorsement about going ahead to the tender, to note the the engagement process, and that actually once that procurement starts, that a new service would then start in April 21. So I'm happy to take questions. Hopefully the report is self-explanatory in terms of what's included. Thank you.
Have we any questions for Anna, Lizzie?
One very quick question. On page 36, it says PH are working NAS and COG. What's COG?
The Chief Officers Group for the housing areas. So as I just said, in terms of making sure that any possible impacts or unintended impacts onto housing or adult social services was covered. So it's the two chief groups for those two sets of services, housing and adults, that are being consulted and worked with.
Okay, so Chief Housing Officers Group, is that what it stands for? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Okay. Can I just have one quick point of clarity? This says in the recommendations that mentions cabinet. Is this NCC cabinet? Is this sits with NCC, or is it us as a shadow authority exec?
This is something that would be
just the tender, I'm assuming, is an NCC tender.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it will go back to cabinet, NCC cabinet, in terms of what that service is, and the final specification and feedback on the consultation, which was part of the original agreement that the NCC cabinet made. So this is really just to make sure that the process. So
the feedback will be used to update NCC cabinet and
That's
develop
right.
the service spec. And note that once NCC cabinet is approved, it will start in November 2020. Yeah.
Correct. Yes, that's right, Chair.
I appreciate this is a cut and paste from probably something that went to NCC cabinet, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone was clear on that.
Yeah.
So have we any further questions or queries? So I'll move the recommendations then from the chair that the shadow executive endorses going out to tender for the new contract to address.
Can I just ask?
Apologies, Phil. Yeah.
Sorry, no, sorry, I was a bit.
Sorry,
late.
I see Matt. Apologies, Matt.
I was a bit late putting my hand up, Chair. Sorry.
That's okay.
On page 50, it talks about the procurement approach, and you've got West Northamptonshire, you've got Northampton and Daventry and South Northants. When you say Northampton, do you mean the Greater Northampton growth area, or do you just mean the existing boundary, or what? Because I mean, if you take the larger area, you've got issues in Grange Park and other places that would perhaps more relative to Northampton. I just wonder what you mean by Northampton when you talk about that procurement there.
Okay.
On page,
Do you
sorry,
want to
50
ask a question and then page 50, Anna, and then I'll get Matt's question and then see can you do both at once, Matt?
Thanks, Chair. It wasn't a question, just a minor point on that clarity around whose cabinet it is. So it might be worth just making sure we do get that covered off for transparency and clarity on all the reports as they come to us.
Yeah, this one's definitely your cabinet, mate. Anna.
Sorry, I'm just trying
So
to
are we
see.
talking about Northampton Borough, or sort of shall we call it Metropolitan Northampton, which would be those bits of South Northampton, Daventry that adjoin Northampton? I'm not going to go into NRDA Northampton, that's just too much. But
So my understanding is this is a Northamptonshire-wide contract and procurement, but there are obviously existing areas where this is supporting. So the report may give reference to particular areas or particular services that are being run in those areas at the moment. But actually this is for a whole county view, but with the future unitary footprints in mind in terms of how the delivery then falls in terms of that procurement. So I think the reference given to particular areas will be because of particular existing provision there, but it is a county-wide service and it will be designed for the 2 new unitaries in terms of how it's split.
Does that help, Phil?
No, it splits West Northamptonshire into 2, Northampton and Daventry and South Northants. And now we're being told it's 1 anyway. So I'm just wondering why.
Sorry, I see what you mean. Sorry, I'm struggling to find the page 56 reference that you're talking to.
Yeah.
Page 50, 50.
Yeah, no, sorry.
Yeah. Procurement program.
Yeah, I can't, sorry, I couldn't see that paper. So that's because in terms of health, the way that health has organised itself in terms of areas of health inequalities, they have divided the county into these subset areas. So in the west, there are 2 health areas. One is Northampton and one is South Northampton Daventry. Likewise, in the north, it is Kettering and Corby and East Northampton Wellingborough. So when it's talking about those, it's referencing back to health planning and health inequalities across what is a health geography, as in the partner's health, which is commonly used. So I think that the services are all over the county, but in terms of that reference, it's talking about the way that health organises and plans its services and making sure that we're linked into them, which of course doesn't recognise the unitary boundaries in the same way that we do.
So is NHS view or health view of Northampton?
That's right.
Is that the same as the municipal view of Northampton, which I think is what Phil was driving at? So our places like Grange Park, like
it's the whole of the Northampton borough boundary is recognised by health as Northampton.
Okay.
Okay.
So I shall now go back to the recommendations. Recommendations are on page 31. So recommend that the shadow executive endorses this going out to tender for the new contract to address health inequalities. Note the engagement is taking place from the 1st to the 20th of September, and that the feedback will be used to update NCC cabinet and to develop the service spec. And note that once NCC cabinet approval is obtained, the procurement for this new service will launch in November 2020, and the new service will start on the 1st of April 2021. Are we agreed on that?
Agreed.
Thank you. So, detailed blueprint. I moved to page 55 of the pack, and it's the next 100 odd pages from 55 to 157. Anna.
Thank you, Chair. We're now bringing to the West Northants Shadow Executive meeting the detailed blueprint, which was alluded to when we presented the previous paper, and the high-level blueprint, which set out some very high-level principles and approaches that we were taking to the future design of services. At that time, we committed as well to share further detail that sat below that, which is not different, but actually then takes the information to a new level in terms of making sure that services, staff, stakeholders and other people could see what we were planning in terms of the day one safe and legal approach. So this report now contains that level of detail, and it's recommended that the Shadow Executive note the content of the detailed blueprint, which, as I said, sets out how services will operate, notes the key elements of service functions that we now plan to transform, the so-called plus that we've talked about on previous occasions, notes the key activities that will be undertaken in the first year of the council, which I'll come back to in terms of what's in the detailed blueprint, and also the high-level feedback that we've included in this report, and which I will add to in terms of some further feedback that's been received since this was published. And we request that the Shadow Exec adopt the detailed blueprint as the basis for day one functional design. We've previously discussed in terms of this report that we've been working on this for some considerable time, and the work that we have been doing has been designed in the first instance to achieve a safe and legal transfer to the new authorities on April 21. That's been done in the context, as members will know, of COVID, and under very clear instructions that in the first instance, the priorities of this were that we made sure the services could perform their legal functions on day one, that we minimised the disruption to staff and customers, and from a staff perspective, particularly that we avoided, where possible, avoided them having to transfer twice, so into one authority and then again into a second one. That we made sure that what we did was value for money and was affordable, and that we did not disrupt in any way the COVID effort that was been going on during this year, and particularly during that period of lockdown when all services were focused first and foremost on responding to that incident. So the attached report gives you significant detail that's been created by the programme teams, and as far as possible, subject to the caveats I've just given, working alongside service leads and subject matter experts, programme staff and SROs that were assigned to each area. They do set out a greater level of granularity, and they obviously are seeking to identify opportunities to bring together services, to transform where we can before day one, and to set out, again, some aspirations and plans during the first year where we will be able to transform and improve services. The detailed blueprints have a consistent format for every service area where members can now see the source of the function, i.e. whether the staff come from the district and boroughs or the county council or both, the scope of services included in each area, the potential staff within scope of each area, which obviously will be subject to change as we move towards vesting day and staff come and go and get employed by the councils, and where we know it, any investment that has been identified to help transform that service. I'd also note that the detailed blueprint provides for staff and unions some very specific aspects for each of the service areas in terms of what the offer of that service will be, its activities, its planned location. And at that point, I should add that one of our overriding principles has been to try and avoid that disruption for day one and not to move people from their planned location. Any IT systems, any changes to customer channels or approaches, the key partners and providers that we'll have to work with in terms of the transfer of those services, the plus elements which we've talked about in terms of changes and new tools and systems and processes that were put in place, and those key year one activities. We've also covered in these services, again, a repetition of the approach in terms of which services in NCC would split and be disaggregated, and where we might have to host or provide a lead authority model with services provided from one to the other. Transformation in terms of its future aspirations. First and foremost, we wanted to make sure that members were confident that these services would operate effectively on day one. And that is the focus of these blueprints, and why in some cases, the work that we're going to do and the changes are limited. We've obviously been working quite closely with service leads across the council, and we'll now start working with transformation directors appointed for the West and the North to look more at quick wins that we might identify before day one, opportunities to work better together and ideally to bring services together before day one if we can, improve processes, benefits from our shared assets and consolidated contracts, to reduce handoffs and to create future potential efficiencies. And obviously we're going to be doing that in the face of what is clearly an emerging pressure of COVID and an emerging challenging first financial year in terms of some of the financial impacts of COVID this year. I'd like to draw members' attention to the section 6 on feedback from stakeholders. Obviously, these high-level blueprints have been, and the detailed blueprints, sorry, have been shared with staff and unions. And we have undertaken a number of YouTube pre-recorded videos and briefings for staff and for members of both councils. And in the background, we've also developed a frequently asked questions log where we are going to record and have been recording all staff questions and queries, and that will be regularly updated and communicated to staff. We do know, and the feedback obviously is that there's a huge amount of information for people to take in here, but we've purposely provided that detail to try and reassure and prepare staff and members for the changes ahead. But I'm sure Paul would join me in saying this is the start of that discussion. This is not a fait accompli, and we're absolutely listening. And if there are different ways of doing things, subject to the caveats we've talked, then obviously we will take those into account and consider how they might be developed or changed going forward if we can accommodate it within those restrictions. Obviously, as you would expect, the majority of staff and unions were understandably concerned about what it meant for staff on day one in terms of their jobs, their terms and condition, and whether there'll be any redundancies. And obviously, locations was another key one for all staff. So it's just worth covering a couple of those points. First, we have confirmed to staff and unions there are no plans for significant redundancies at this point, but we do know that there is duplication in services. And as we go to aggregate the 8 councils, clearly we will have more staff than we need in some areas, but there will also be staff in areas where we will need to recruit more staff, because actually splitting NCC services particularly will mean that we need additional staff to be able to manage them effectively. Obviously, if that happens, then we will make sure that there's an opportunity for redeployment, and we will work in detailed consultation with the unions and staff. Some of the wider feedback we've had on the blueprint in positives was that people were heartened by the number of positive initiatives. It was good to have further clarity and assurance about what wouldn't change, and that the blueprint started to make the new councils feel real. But we also needed to be mindful in terms of communicating the detail and the fact that many staff may not be able to access them by IT or indeed through the YouTube videos. And we're also conscious that some people said that the YouTube videos were an imparting of information rather than a two-way conversation. And ideally, we'd have much preferred to do roadshows and face-to-face contact and a two-way conversation, and we will seek every opportunity to do that. There were also quite a few concerns raised in terms of why weren't we keeping some services at county level, why specific functions weren't grouped together, or when we would be bringing out more information, in terms of detailed staff structures, whether we would have a balanced budget and whether there would be some specific locations that would change. And we will be working through all of those. Clearly, the blueprints are not structure charts, as we've talked before, and they're not policy documents. But we are going to make sure that we address the staff questions that have been asked, as I've said. Since we've published this report, we've since today had very detailed feedback from the unions, who have obviously highlighted their concerns, and I know leaders got copies of this, about the time that they've had to consider these, although they were actually provided to the unions, I believe on the 13th of August. But we will engage in a further discussion, and again, I'd reiterate, this is the start of a process. They have been very keen to ask questions about how we're going to consult with staff, and also why we have not consulted more widely with service managers. And again, just to reiterate, we've been having to do this in the context of COVID, and certain decisions and designs and questions had to be considered with that in mind. And we're now moving to that deeper engagement where absolutely we will start to answer those questions. And we will do exactly the same with the unions, both in terms of FAQ and an open dialogue in terms of those next steps. With regard to location, I think members should be clear by now that there are no plans generally to change locations, but I would reiterate in terms of equalities, impact assessments, detailed consultation, concerns about changes like that, that where they are changing, and one example of that would be adults, is we will be in detailed consultation with staff about what those changes mean, and to make sure that we meet everybody's needs in terms of any disabilities or equalities impacts. In terms of risk and resources, I'd just highlight that these blueprints are designed to be within the existing MTFP plans and budgets, but clearly we're going to seek opportunities for further financial benefits. It goes without saying that the greatest single risk to the programme remains COVID and the pressure on staff and the finances, and also how demand may or may not increase as the pandemic changes and we enter the winter period. So there is admittedly a lot to consider in these blueprints. Paul and I are both happy to answer any questions, but I think probably as a closing comment for me, just before asking for comments from Paul, is these detailed blueprints are designed to be an extension of what previously has been issued. They shouldn't be different, and if there are any differences, then we clearly will pick that up. But it is the start of a conversation with a focus on making sure that all services will function and there'll be minimal disruption for day one. Paul, did you want to add anything before we hand back?
Thank you, Anna. The only thing for me to add as the programme director is, and I'm sure I don't need to remind everybody, is about 130 or so days to go. So we are balancing the need to be able to talk to people and listen to what their views are. But there is a critical path, as I explained earlier, to ensure that we've created these two organisations as set out in the structural change order, which was to create two autonomous organisations from the 8 existing organisations. By and large, the blueprint is the path to get to that full vesting day and how we're going to treat those services. So there might be some room for discussion around some of them. There is a clear rationale for why we've ended up with some lead and hosted ones, and we're more than happy to talk through and explain that and listen to the feedback through that process. But just reminding everybody of the clock ticking and the need to move forward so that we've got a platform that we can then build on after vesting day and the transformation opportunities that will be presented, where there'll be every opportunity for staff to be involved in those exciting times ahead. But just right now, it is the basic wiring diagram. What goes in the house, it is still up for debate. What goes on the walls and all that analogy around we're building a house here, and this is the wiring diagram, and we don't get a lot of choice in that. But we're more than willing to listen to feedback and consider that feedback, and obviously explain why some of the recommendations are as they are.
Thank you, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Anna and Paul. As you mentioned there, Paul, was 130 days to go and the clock is ticking. Just reference to the aggregation bit that Anna talked about, and the staff who we all care an awful lot about in our respective authorities. How a bit of reassurance that we've got time to go through the proper and good due sort of process and diligence around any movement of staff and the impact on staff.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Gobby. We've, funnily enough, we spent all day today, Paul and myself, which is no mean feat with so much going on, with the new transformation directors and some of the core programme team and programme managers talking about exactly that, and how we engage in that next process in terms of aggregation, and how we make sure, as Paul says, we keep the safe and legal stuff ticking along, and all the key things, the simple things, but the things that could make us fall over on day one, security passes for people, that contracts get novated, that calls come into the right place, etc. That we make sure all of that happens whilst recognising we are building two new organisations. And we've had a long conversation today about how we're going to engage with those staff and the managers. And there's a key next step, which is about the structure, the senior structure that sits below the chief exec and the executive directors that have been appointed. And then we start that conversation with those senior managers of those services and engage with them about what changes, and use the change champions that Paul's talked about as well to support them with all their questions, to make sure that they get a chance to understand what's going on, to feed in and give their good ideas as well, because we're very keen to see that, because we all want to also build a pipeline for what can change post day one in terms of transformation and how we bring those services together. So very much a detailed piece of work we've been looking at, and absolutely we want to get out and talk to those service staff and make sure that we engage with them and the unions on how that happens, and to get all of their queries answered, because first and foremost, we want to make sure we keep all the very good people that we've got, we don't lose anybody, and we want to give them that certainty, and we want to give them that excitement about the new West Northants that we're building, so that they want to be part of that going forward.
Thank you.
Anyone else? There's no blue hands going up. Well, first I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here when I say to Anna, Paul and the whole team, because I know it's not just those two, thank you for getting us thus far to this point. There is a huge amount of detail, and I know there's still a lot more detail on the detail that people still crave for. We have got some feedback from trade unions and others. I have certainly seen within one of the trade union feedback, suggestions about doing things in one particular service. I would appeal to people to come up with suggestions. I've heard a few comments at our full authority meeting of this sort of, I don't like it. It's difficult to read or whatever. What I'm struggling to hear at times is a constructive suggestion that says, have you thought about moving this from here to there, or doing that, or something, rather than just don't like it, what do you want to do about it? Well, don't like it, which bit of it don't you like? All of it. That kind of rather obtuse dialogue. I do appeal to people to sort of come up with suggestions that we could look at and work with, and we can flex this as we go along. But I think what would also be quite useful at this stage is to say that we need to always keep an eye on the limits of our ambition at the moment. So, I started the meeting by saying the announcement by Boris at 8 o'clock, but who knows where we're heading into this. And COVID is without doubt our number one priority. And we may have to flex our own ambition as this moves along, because we might have a real need to refocus a lot of our energies and attentions back on saving lives and the COVID response. But for the time being, I think we're making good progress, and I trust executive colleagues would agree with me in that sort of assessment. I don't see any blue hands going up. So there were a number of recommendations on the blueprint on page 55. So we're being asked to note the content of note the key elements of the services which you plan to transform, the plus element, note the key activities that will be undertaking during the first year, note the high level feedback that we've had from the staff, trade unions and members, and adopt the detailed blueprint as the basis of the day one functional design, subject to any identification of agreed further opportunities to transform and improve service areas during the remaining months leading up to vesting day on the 1st of April. So, colleagues, are we agreed on that? I think we are. So thank you once again, and we can move on to safeguarding adults option paper. As I've got the word adults in it, I'm definitely sure this is for you, Anna.
It is indeed. Thank you, Chair. So thank you again. The purpose of this report is to bring to members a decision or a recommendation around the Adult Safeguarding Board and its future constitution. The new authorities do have an obligation to establish a safeguarding board under the 2014 Care Act, and we need to seek a formal decision now about how best the two unitaries fulfil that obligation. in terms of the safeguarding board. So the recommendation that we're asking members to consider is to consider and agree the recommendation for an establishment of a single strategic safeguarding partnership to provide support to both North and West Northamptonshire unitaries on day one, and to support the review and revision of the existing safeguarding board constitution in terms of reference and the roles and responsibilities of the independent chair. The paper sets out a number of options, two options particularly, which is obviously to either separate the board into a North and a West one, or to maintain a single adult safeguarding board across the whole of the county. And the recommendation is that the latter, to keep a single board. And I just want to quickly cover some of the logic and reasons for that before seeking members' support for that. The CARE Act makes it very clear that there's a legal framework, not just for how local authorities run this, but also that it should be a system and partner board that looks across protecting adults at risk of abuse and neglect across the whole of the area. This duty includes the creation and leadership of a multi-agency local adult safeguarding system that prevents abuse and neglect and acts quickly to stop it where it spots it. And the safeguarding board is there to provide assurance to members that its statutory duties are being met. The existing safeguarding board as it exists today covers the whole of the county, and its key partners are party to that are the County Council, the police and the CCG, and it is funded by all three partners who provide representatives alongside other members and key stakeholders who sit on those board, and then a series of task and finish and working groups, operational groups that sit behind that. Work is underway, just to make a point, about separating the safeguarding teams who actually investigate local safeguarding issues, which will be dedicated to the West and the North, and that happens regardless of this recommendation. So I just wanted to make sure that all members were aware of that. But the board itself is there to oversee all partner activity and outcomes in relation to safeguarding concerns. And it should be remembered that service provision and locations across the county actually will have residents from both North and West and from outside of the county who come in to those locations and get services provided to them. And they are not necessarily based just within the boundaries of the two unitary footprint. So there are a number of advantages that are set out in the paper to retaining a single partnership, and not least that it will be far more likely that members, partner organisations attend that board. If we split them, then we are asking those to attend two different conversations and boards and forums to work through two different processes, when quite often they will be considering a single location or provision within the county. So we want to make sure that we get the most likely input and support of our partners, that the board encompasses best practice, which generally has been to keep partners together to make it easier and more cohesive in terms of policies, in terms of consistency for residents and stakeholders and also providers. To make sure we get an economy of scale in terms of funding, because if we split them, we will have to provide separate budgets, separate chairs, and all the other constituent parts that support the board. And a single board would not interfere with the individual unitary authority arrangements or duties, and each would continue to obviously be represented by its DAS, who would be members of that board. There is a further consideration about alignment to the Children's Safeguarding Partnership Board, which I understand has also been agreed, or that it could stay as a single one across the county. So we're recommending that it does stay as one, and that it can be reviewed at a later date. But this will then give us that strategic oversight and a continuation and certainty for partners who are really keen that we continue the cross-working. And that means it would be a single and shared budget contributed to by both the two new unitaries, who would contribute to the overall running costs and also any safeguarding adults reviews that were undertaken in the case of a death and where that was required. So I think the report generally speaks for itself in terms of the advantages and disadvantages, and I would ask members therefore to consider the establishment of this single board and to support, as I said, the change terms of reference and the expansion of some of those roles that will give greater depth and experience for members to rely on in terms of those new unitaries and the experience of managing social care and the safeguarding risks that sit below that. So yes, I'm happy to take questions, Chair, based on those recommendations in the report in front of you.
Any questions for Anna? Phil, I saw your blue hand this time. And then Richard.
sorry, I'll unmute myself again. On page 163, Anna, you say there are examples of combined boards working successfully, and you refer to London boroughs. How many, are there really in total? I mean, I'm just thinking, has Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole and Dorset got one combined one still? Has Cheshire East and Cheshire West still got a combined board, or have they all gone their separate ways? I'm just trying to get a feel for the overall landscape on this. And secondly, what's the member engagement, member involvement on these boards? How many members are there, or if any? I'm not too sure. It's not something I'm familiar with.
Been involved. So generally the trend nationally has been to keep integrated boards, and obviously the overall trend in terms of partnership working is to integrated systems and ways of working and adopting common policies. Certainly Dorset look to keep those join-ups, because, as I said, people don't respect geographic boundaries and often will move between providers, or a West Northants customer, for example, could end up in either North or West Northants, or indeed out of county. So they do tend to find that it works far better if there is a single place to go to, and coordination then regionally is much easier. But equally, there are some areas that have split them, but I would say that the general trend and the general best practice seem to be to keep them together, because they do work better at scale, and you pick up far more cross-area issues. If you think about working with the police, they obviously are working in a different way across county, and you make sure that you then get that common sharing of information and risks and issues, and then a common response to them. In terms of member involvement, attached to this paper obviously is a suggested sort of terms of reference for the board. Certainly in terms of the way it functions now, there are lead members on that, in terms of both portfolio holders and opposition members. And really, in terms of its final constitution and who attends, it will be up to the unitaries as well to put forward and have members on there. But there is always member representation on them, and I think that's a very key and important part of what they do in terms of understanding what's going on, and particularly if something serious has happened or there's a serious case review or whatever, and giving people sight and transparency of that and the conversations that happen. So there will be member representation, and that's been built into the terms of reference.
Okay. Just picking up on what Phil said there, looking at some of the other people who've done unitary recently, I wonder how many of them started off with possibly joint boards and then probably separated over time. So I know when the Bedfordshire councils separated, there were quite a number of things held together initially, and then over time they separated out, and I think some of the last ones actually happened only last year, almost 10 years after they were initially kicked off. Will this be also something that could be kept under review, and then if in a couple of years' time they want to have a West and a North separate board, that would still be possible?
Absolutely. It's one of those things in terms of there is a sort of continuation, I guess, of some of the joint cross-working at the moment. But there is nothing to stop the authorities at any point considering this. Obviously, they go through an annual cycle. They tend to have an annual conference, for example, and a year-end report in terms of safeguarding board activity. But there's nothing to stop it at any point, either council deciding that that's what it wants to do and it wants to split away, and making that change happen. As long as the Care Act requirements are met in terms of it being a multi-agency board and it fulfilling its duties, then there's nothing to stop councils changing later on now.
Yeah, all right. So I have Richard, then Lizzie, then Matt. So Richard.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really torn on this one. We started right from the beginning. This is the ideology coming in. I'm not a great fan of ideology, but we should have two of everything unless there's a really, really good reason to keep one. But I do appreciate the importance of cross-border partnership working. But the question I've got is how big, do we keep it at county, or is it even better to have a regional board? How big do you have this? And to have our own board focusing on our our own population, producing our own data, looking at our own problems, because we are going to be two separate sovereign bodies. And I'm just wondering, with one board, will there be a rub between the two with regard to the way we tackle the challenges? So I'm pleased to say we will review it. I would like a little bit more understanding on some of the authorities that are currently running this that went to unitary and whether they're planning to split. At the end of the day, what I want is what's most convenient for the partner agencies. You know, if they need to attend 2 meetings, they need to attend 2 meetings. What I'm really keen to have is what is best for the population of the West Authority. And so, you know, I haven't got enough stuff here to make a definitive or to go against this definitively. But I, you know, do want to ensure we keep an eye on this, Chair, and review it to ensure that what we haven't done is what was convenient in place of what was the right thing to do. If that makes sense.
Could I just provide some reassurance, Chair, please, if that's a...
Yeah.
Councillor Auger, what I'd say is all independent chairs form part of regional chairs forums as well, to make sure that they exchange cross-border understanding and, you know, share information and intelligence and everything else. And the same happens in terms of the DASs. To make sure that they pick up these things, and there's kind of national best practice that's passed down and shared to make sure that everybody picks up, you know, issues that they need to address and watches out for things that happen. And I accept, you know, it is a challenging one in terms of, as you say, how do you address that? I mean, I think our partners have been quite vocal in really seeking this to be one thing that is kept together, and it's not a convenience thing for them. I think it's because when I think about some of the reports that come to that board, they recognise, you know, shared issues, county lines issues, you know, domestic abuse, all sorts of different issues, and as I said, lots of out of county placements and things like that as well, which affect us all. But equally, they're still able to deal with kind of nuances. So a particular area concern, a particular rising, for example, the board this year looked at street homelessness and particularly the issues in a death that happened in Northampton town. And so it's able to do both. But I think what it loses in parting company potentially is that intelligence network and that sharing of solutions and challenges. It's not just the convenience of it. I think it really does work as a cross group and cross, you know, wider geography. It gains a huge amount, and I think the police would say that too, in terms of keeping it as one, but allowing it to accept that there are the two nuances of the DASs and the areas below it.
I'd like to just come back on that, Chair. You know, in the Thames Valley, we had 3 counties, all had their separate boards, and that worked quite effectively. I can understand the police wanting one board, but I don't accept that it impinges on the sharing of intelligence and information, because that should be done with all of our sovereign bodies that border our other, you know, Milton Keynes. We should be sharing intelligence and information with them. It's no different to that, but we don't share a board with Milton Keynes. So you see, I don't think the arguments are strong enough to say this is an exception. But as I said, you know, I haven't got enough to really go against it. What I, as I said, interested in, it's sure that we review it to ensure that we are providing the best services for the residents, especially in adult social care.
Okay, thank you. Lizzie, then Matt.
Yeah, so I've actually sat on this board, so I've got experience of what's actually been going on in it, and I'm actually very clear that I feel that what Anna's been saying about the shared learning and the benefit analysis of the parties being together is actually outweighs the negatives, and that's not just about cost. Much will depend on the North and West working together on this effectively. So from my perspective, I would say keep it as it is for the time being and review it. based on the fact that there will be greater outcomes if it is kept together, but if it doesn't work, then we split. That's my view.
Mark?
Yeah, thank you. To support most of what's been said, really, certainly support the notion of reviewing it after a little while. Because when I was reading the paper earlier, I recall and think about the principles and the conversations and difficult conversations and debates we've had on this journey. And I think it is right to try and stick to those principles of where it's possible to have two. But I think at the moment, we've got to consider the wider context, the impact of COVID. And indeed, that question Richard put is what's best for right now for the people. And also, I think you've got to add into that the system. And I don't think the system would take splitting this at the moment. So I'm happy to support it and to keep it as it is, but with that notion that we can review at an appropriate time in the future. And I think it's a similar argument for the Children's Board as well. A similar sort of debate around the system and keeping things, keeping things as they are while we're getting through those early stages. Thank you.
You're jumping on to the next agenda item. Phil?
I'll just come back on a quick point, Chair. I fully support it, and I think the right way to go is to keep it together and keep it under review. Totally support that. Anna referred to the fact that the chairs are part of a regional grouping as well, and then Richard mentioned Milton Keynes, and I do think that there's great association between Northampton and Milton Keynes. But of course, when we talk about regions, what region are we talking about with the chair being involved in? Because Northampton and Northamptonshire, West Northamptonshire, I think is inappropriately in the East Midlands, and I think we've far more to gain from being in a region with Milton Keynes and other areas like that that have far better connected to Northampton than West Northamptonshire than Nottingham, Derby, and wherever. I just wondered if a bit of clarity around that, because I think that would be interesting to know. So thank you, Chair.
So just to respond to Councillor Larratt, we are in the East Midlands group, but Milton Keynes is as well. So actually Milton Keynes is alongside us, and Leicester and Derbyshire, all the way up to Lincolnshire, and Rutland as well is in there. So it's quite a mixed group, and we already benefit therefore from those links to Milton Keynes. And obviously in terms of our hospitals and everything else, that's quite a key one too. So we're part of a group that includes them, which I think is really helpful.
Thanks, Chair. That's most helpful.
Thank you. And I thought I had another hand up. Oh no, that's everyone. So any other comments on this? So the recommendation then is that we consider and agree the recommendation to establish a single strategic safeguarding partnership to provide support for North and West Northamptonshire unitary authorities, and to support the review and revision of existing adult safeguarding board constitution, terms of reference, roles and responsibilities of the independent chair, and support. Are we agreed on that?
Are we not putting anything in, Chair, about reviewing?
Well, we can. I can put.
Yes, please, Chair.
Will and to ask what the West Northants executive review this after the first year of operation.
12 months. Yeah, I think that would be
okay.
Good, Chair. Thank you, Phil.
Are we happy with that as a third recommendation? Okay, so we'll move all three on block.
Is 12 months? Sorry, is 12 months realistic?
Well, it could be, Lizzie, that the review says it's too early to do this. We need to review it again in 12 months. So
yeah,
which I would be happy with. That
fair enough.
At least it's not saying it's sometime never.
Yeah. Okay.
Who knows where we're going to be in 12 months' time?
Yeah. Okay.
Are we agreed on this? Thank you. That's carried. So we'll move on to children's safeguarding.
Can I just ask, what if the North say they don't want to agree to this? What happens then?
We'll have another meeting.
Yeah.
What happens then, Anna?
The purpose of the joint implementation executive should be that any of those issues should be aired at that forum. Yeah. And therefore I am hoping that when it gets to formal decision making, any of those wrinkles have already been ironed out. That's certainly the process that we're attempting to follow. So I'm hoping, if any of our colleagues in the north are listening on YouTube, that they don't interject a little left at the lights and cause a little frisson of activity for us all. So I'm hoping that they will adopt this, but of course they're free to make whatever decision they want. So moving on to children's, page 189.
Thank you, Chair. So this report.
Thank you, Cassie.
This report is similar to Anna's, the children. So the recommendations is to have a single Northamptonshire Safeguarding Children's Partnership from the 1st of April 2021, and it's agreed that a hosting model for the Northampton Safeguarding Children Partnership Business Support Office to be located with the Joint Director of Children's Services in the North. The requirements for a Safeguarding Children's Partnership is under Working Together Safeguarding Children 2018, so slightly different regulations than with adults, and so there is a slightly different setup. It's led by the three representatives of the three statutory safeguarding partners, which is County Council, Police and the Clinical Commissioning groups at a strategic level, and underneath that sits a range of subgroups which manages the work. It's jointly funded by all agencies, and there is a small team which is employed in the business office, which is currently hosted in Northamptonshire County Council. The Safeguarding Children's Board discussed the proposal for 2 unitaries and the consideration along with similarly to adults is that there should be one safeguarding partnership to support both unitary authorities. Anna outlined some of the advantages of that, which are consistent, effective, joined up approach, covers the whole county again, so that there are effective and robust strengthening, improving abilities across both unitaries. There is a mechanism to have shared learning across both unitaries, similar policies and procedures. There'll be one point of contact in terms of the undertaking any child safeguarding practice, and there'll be one point of scrutiny and challenge of the individual partner safeguarding arrangements. Duplicating the arrangements will involve additional cost, and different arrangements will be challenging, as Anna pointed out before, for partner agencies working across both councils. This has been discussed with the key partners and stakeholders, and if you have a look on page 194, there are a number of PAM partnership examples where it's not just 2 unitaries, but it exists in a wider region. Similarly, with adults, we have effective partnership and relationships with our safeguarding partnerships, our DCSs in the East Midlands. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Kathy. And I should have said congratulations on being appointed to the shared DCS role. But as we have a shared DCS role, I think the logic of this is a little easier to work with. That it'll probably make your job a lot easier as well, and having a single board. Interesting too that one of the partnerships that you point to is Hampshire and Isle of Wight. So if it can work across the Solent, I'm sure we can make it work across the Nen. Any Adam?
Yeah, just a very brief comment, Chair, just to endorse your comments that this is a far simpler process. I think the presence or the upcoming presence of the Children's Trust makes these proposals relatively straightforward. We need to keep these things simple. We need to ensure a smooth transition, and we need to make sure that that Children's Trust is operating in the best interests of all children across Northamptonshire. You know, this isn't a space to start injecting narrow ideological interests. We need to make sure that there is as much stability in that service area as possible come its own vesting day.
Yeah, agreed. Anybody else got anything to add? So the recommendations on this one are on page
192. 192.
192.
Point 1.1
Yep,
and
thank you.
1.2.
Oh. Right, so are we agreed? Yes. Are we agreed then to continue with a single Northamptonshire safeguarding partnership from the 1st of April and agreed to host the model for NSCP business support to be located with the Joint Director of Children's Services in the North? Are we agreed? Thank you. That's been carried.
Thank you, Chair.
So thank you, Kathy. So item 11A, we've got two motions that were stood referred from the Shadow Authority meeting. First one on climate change. Adam? You're on mute.
Apologies, the wonders of technology there. I don't know if Democratic Services are able to pull up the proposed amendment that I emailed to them earlier this morning. If not, I'm more than happy to talk through the proposed amendment for members' benefit.
I can do that, Councillor Brown, if you bear with me for 1 second.
Should just say, whilst we're waiting for the proposals to come up on the screen, for people who don't know, I'm of course the chair of the Environment Task and Finish group that at the moment is studying ways in which we can most effectively start tackling those issues once the new council comes into being. So if I can direct members' attention to the proposed motion. I've highlighted words to insert in yellow, and words to delete are struck through in the traditional fashion. So firstly, I've proposed inserting the word "some of," because South Northamptonshire Council has not declared a climate emergency. Therefore, that's a minor correction. On the first recommendation put forward by Councillor Smith, I have proposed that we simplify the recommendation by removing climate emergency groups and inserting members of the public, so that we can draw on relevant knowledge, expertise and commitment wherever it may come from. I've then gone on to slightly tweak the second recommendation by removing the word "all" from all partners and inserting "relevant." There are, of course, hundreds of partners that our sovereign councils work with at this moment in time. It would be unrealistic to propose that we engage with absolutely all of them. So we've already, in fact, in the Environment Task and Finish group, started drawing up lists of key partners that sovereign councils work with at the moment, and started considering further partners that we will wish to engage with in order to inform our work as it goes along. And finally, just in line with the minor amendment on the first introductory paragraph, I've simply removed climate emergency and inserted environmental matters more generally. This is not a political stance. I'm not downplaying the issue in any sense. This is just a matter of consistency. And I would point out that all of the work that we're undertaking in the Environment Task and Finish group is geared towards ensuring that the new West Northamptonshire Council will be considering environmental matters in absolutely everything that it does. It will be at the core of what we do. We will be seeking to ensure that the fantastic biodiversity across the West Northamptonshire area is enhanced, not just maintained, but enhanced. Also that we take measures to reduce our carbon footprint, to improve the air quality so that our children and grandchildren are breathing clean air. And we'll also be looking at building standards and how we can build greener and better to ensure that we are doing everything possible to tackle this massively serious problem that we're all facing. So I hope that I've kept with the spirit of the motion as it was intended. It's a shame that Councillor Smith isn't here to either endorse or otherwise, but I put these amendments to members of the committee, and I hope that we can approve the proposals. As I say, most of this work, if not all of it, is already being done by my environment task and finish group. So really, it's just reaffirming that ongoing work.
Thank you for that. Do we have a seconder? Phil Larratt. Thanks, Phil. Anyone wish to speak on this? So can we have a vote on the amendment? Are we happy to accept that? Agreed. And can we have a vote on the substantive motion as amended? Thank you. That's been carried. So item 11B is the motion that came in from Councillor Harries, and I see he did and sat through the whole meeting for this moment. So Jonathan, over to you. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to Cabinet. As you're aware, my concern is the spend of 1.4 million of taxpayers' money on a tendering process to guide the thinking of the new unitary authority, a spend which may not be necessary at this time. There are a number of issues at play. The approach to tendering and associated spend, the timing, no one doubts, by the way, that this will be needed at some point, and the choice of how the contract itself is run. The options facing the new authority for the roads contract appear to be a thin client relationship as per the current arrangement, a thick client relationship, or direct labour, bringing the service in-house. We have clear evidence that the thin client arrangement has provided challenges for Northamptonshire County Council, reference the Scrutiny Committee from January 2020. At this committee, concern was raised about this approach, meaning the contractor was both judge and jury in the decision-making process. Clearly, there is a cost involved, even if the council used the HMEP standardisation toolkit approach. However, an estimate from a professional in my ward suggests that £600,000 is a more realistic figure for this work. This is not a guess, it's an estimate from an expert based on years of experience. It looks, therefore, as if we may be paying over the odds at 1.4 million, and we are in no position to overspend or waste money. At full council, reference to this spend being a low percentage of the overall contract, it's not clear what the contract value is, but let's say it's circa 50 million, is still 1.4 million pounds. If the incoming administration chooses a different approach or option to that recommended by the consultants, then potentially that's wasted money. It will make any independent decision made by the new council very difficult. Turning over a decision that has been expensive to make will be very difficult to do so. So in effect, this may well tie the hands of any future administration. No one underestimates the financial challenges that face the unitary. The problem will only be compounded if we continue to appear to fail to seek value for money. £1.4 million is a lot of money, regardless of viewing it in the context of the whole contract. It won't take much or many more overspends before things clearly begin to add up. Why is it important? The problem of council finances has recently been brought into sharp focus for me. I have residents in my ward facing the loss of bus services and being told there is no money. Their request for a relatively small amount of money to subsidise the service appears to have been refused. So I have a number of questions for this shadow cabinet. If this goes forward, who are the consultants tasked with delivering this tendering process? More importantly, what approach has been taken to ensure value for money in appointing those consultants? How are the fees broken down? What steer are we giving to the consultants in their brief? In other words, which option of relationship are we favouring? And the contract will operate across both councils, as raised earlier in an earlier discussion, both West and North. So what happens if either administration decides not to follow the recommendation and choose a different path? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. So there's a number of points there. I don't know if there's anyone can answer those questions off the tops of their head, but my understanding as we're at thus far is that what was being advocated by the Liberal Democrat group at the authority meeting was NCC do the work and the shadows take the decision is actually the process that's being followed. So the decision making will still sit with those with the new bodies, and I think now, because again of an unavoidable COVID delay, it will definitely be a decision for the new authorities and not even for the shadows. But I may be needing to be stand corrected on that particular point, but I'm pretty sure it now will be a decision for the authorities. I believe NCC have already done in-house versus outsourced appraisal and still decided that having a number of council employees leaning on a shovel might help the stereotype of council employees, but doesn't actually do anything to help the roads maintenance. A few times now you made reference to the 1.4 million, but I would suggest that this is for the 2 contracts, not 1. My understanding is that we've put it out on well, certainly what I asked for, I remember being at the meeting, is 3 lots, lot A being the north, lot B being the west, lot C being west and north, and if there's a compelling reason to do it, then we will look at that. So it'll be perfectly possible to have on that basis any outcome of a single west, single north, or a joint contract. I think also that 1.4 million, the figure of 50 million is the annual cost. The contract could be 7 to 10 years. So you probably need to look at the 1.4 million across the 500 million, probably multiplied by 2. It is a contract of that kind of size. So that is the context, I think, that all of us put it in. It is also well known, and certainly not challenged by me, that the existing, or the previous, not the existing, the previous contract was deficient in a number of areas, and I think a number of people would agree with that. The interim contract has already made a number of changes to bring people who you rightly identify as being on the customer side, to bring them client side, so that client provider split is a lot clearer now in this interim contract for the next 18 months to 2 years than it was in the previous contract that expired on the 1st of April of this year. So arguably lessons are certainly being learned from the old contract, and hopefully people will begin to see the differences in the short term between that. But I also think it's going to be a little bit difficult to argue that the existing or the previous contract was a little deficient. In order to ensure then that we have expertise and that we can ensure that those deficiencies are plugged, will cost to get relevant expertise, but we're going to complain about the cost of buying in the expertise to make sure that we learn the lessons and make sure we plug the gaps that were rightly identified in the previous contract. So I'm not entirely sure that I can recommend that this shadow authority executive accepts that we request SNC to down tools and do nothing. When we were first briefed, as not even before shadow, as a group of leaders, that this contract was going to expire on the 31st of March 2020. At the time, we were targeting a 1st of April 2020 go live date. We all knew that we needed to do something, and I think that was like November 2018. So the contract that Keir had covered a lot more than just roads maintenance, and all of that needs to be looked at. It would be silly in the extreme to end up on the first day of our new councils, as might have been the case on that scenario, to say, oh, a traffic light has gone out and there's no one available to change the bulb because the contract expired yesterday, or a dangerous pothole needs to be filled and there's no one to do it because the contract expired yesterday. So there will be an element of business as usual and continuation into the new authorities, but I don't think we're doing anything which in any way prevents the new authorities from making their own decisions in their own way. Is there anybody else that we should speak, Matt?
Thank you, Chair. I think you've made a very fair summary of what the position is at the moment, and I too will struggle to support this. It is a fair question posed by Jonathan Harris to ask and inquire about this, particularly of as you know, some of the lessons that have been highlighted around that scrutiny review. But I think that's some of the learning that we all need to acknowledge and take forward into the new contract. And indeed, a lot of actions have already come off the back of some of the ills, if you like, of that learning, and a lot of staff have already been brought back into NCC on our side to manage that properly, as you highlighted there. But I think there's got to be a lot of lessons learned, particularly around the issues that scrutiny raised. And this will be signed, as was mentioned at the main authority meeting back in August. It will be signed by the West by the time we've gone through the whole procurement procedure. So it's right, in my book, to keep that going and let the West Authority have oversight and sign this contract when it's there and ready to be signed. But as I say, it's right for Jonathan to ask some questions. There's some points there that we probably need to come back to him on, but I don't think we should really support the motion. Thank you.
Anyone else got anything to say? Okay, so can I ask any members in favour of the motion? And those against? That has been defeated. So thank you for that. Thank you, Jonathan, for your time, and thank you for staying to the end. Item 12, exempt items. So can I move that we exclude all press and public? And please stop the live feed on YouTube.